All right. Welcome to another episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Constantine Sandis. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Hertfordshire. And he's a founding director of Lex Academic and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK. His work centers around philosophical questions relating to moral psychology, action, explanation, and interpersonal understanding. Constantine Sandis is the editor of the book Dylan at 80 Used to Go Like That, and Now It Goes Like This. And he's one of the contributing authors prominently featured in Helen De Cruz's new book, Philosophy Illustrated, 42 Thought Experiments to Broaden Your Mind. Welcome, Constantine.
Thank you so much. And just very quickly, I'm the co-editor of Dylan at 80 with Gary Browning, who did a lot of work on it. So I just wanted to get that out there, not get all the credit.
Absolutely.
Nice to meet you both.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. So before we start on and kind of get into like when we want to focus on Bob Dylan too. So I mean, something we talked about before the show. But before we get into Ludwig Wittgenstein and who he was as a person, we want to focus on the thought experiment mentioned in the book that you obviously wrote and kind of I'm not sure if you co-edited, but the book that you kind of contributed to with Helen De Cruz, right? Because I think Helen was one of, if not the only editor on it.
Editor and illustrator.
Yeah. So I want to give Helen the credit she deserves. I think she was the only editor on it.
Yeah, so it's completely Helen's book. I'm certainly not a co-editor, and if you'd seen me draw, you'd know for certain that I am not an illustrator of the book either. She's done these amazing illustrations, and the book is in press. It's been printed, but we haven't received our copies yet, so I'm waiting. I think there's some distribution stuff over Christmas, but it's there, it exists, and I think we're just all waiting for the copies to be mailed to us. But no, I have nothing to do with the editing process. I was one of the many people she kindly asked to do a little something for.
Right. So before we get into who Ludwig Wittgenstein was, right, can you tell us a bit about the thought experiment of the beetle, or the beetle in the box thought experiment, what that was and why it's relevant?
So the beetle in the box. So I guess it's relevant in this book because it's very nice to visualize. So the book begins with. We can talk a bit about what a thought experiment is and to what extent the beetle in the box counts as a thought experiment. I like to think of. Wittgenstein has I like to think of them as parables or allegories sometimes. So they're little vignettes, I guess we'd say today, little stories, narratives, and we can call it a thought experiment, I think, to some degree. It's what is meant by experiment and that kind of thing. Wittgenstein himself might not have been thrilled by that word because it suggests it's sort of philosophy modeling itself on the sciences and saying we do experiments too, we just do them with the mind or something. And I think he would have maybe wanted to distance himself from that language. But it is a kind of story that's meant to get you to think about how we think about things, so rethink things in a way. And I think Helen it was a very good idea of hers to include this particular story by Wittgenstein in the book because it's very nice to visualize. So the box is really a matchbox. Okay, so we have like little kids. I don't think I did this as a kid. I did all sorts of things as a kid, but I don't know, like they'd put like a little beetle in a matchbox and then keep it as a pet, or worse, I don't know. Kids do all sorts of things, maybe put worms in a matchbox, I don't know. But putting a beetle in a box was, I don't know, do you do that stuff in Brooklyn still?
So honestly, not in our day, in the 90s when we were kids, that wasn't a thing, no.
You weren't No, this might be like a 30s Austrian thing or something.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I could imagine that happening in the 60s or something along those lines. But yeah, in the 90s, we already had video games and Game Boys. I don't think that was prominent.
I can picture. Yeah, I can picture. I mean, it's not something I did expressly, but sure. I'd play with insects when I was younger. Maybe not necessarily collect some, but I have an idea of what kids would do as
Mhm.
far as like putting a beetle in a matchbox and that sort of
Mhm.
thing. Yeah, that sort of activity.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So we can at least imagine what's that's like, and in Helen's case, draw it. So she can draw a nice illustration of a boy with a little kind of box, and now we're sort of thinking like, so here, you know, let's just, for the sake of the thought experiment, it's the three of us,
Mhm.
and we've each got a matchbox,
Mhm.
and we each have a beetle in the box, or at least we talk as if we have a beetle in the box, and that's going to be quite kind of crucial. So we share this language of talking of the beetle in our box, and we kind of, you know, I open my box and I say, my beetle's kind of blue, or my beetle is missing a leg, or whatever. And then you look at yours and you say, oh, mine's purple, or, you know, my beetle has 27 legs. And I'm like, nah, you're lying, or whatever. So we've got this, and now he sets a kind of a rule about this, which you might think is a weird thing to do initially, but he says, suppose that nobody could look into anybody else's box, right? So whether this is just the rule of the game, or whether it's somehow impossible to do this, the point is we never look into the other person's box. We're just kind of describing what's in our box, and you tell me what's in yours, and I tell you what's in mine, and we say, oh, I've got a beetle too, and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
And so here the analogy begins, and he's trying to talk to those philosophers who are thinking things like, you can never know what's in my head, only I can know what's in my head.
Mhm.
Right? So the idea here is that I can tell you what I'm thinking, but how will you know if I'm lying or not? You can't get inside my head to check. So you sort of have to take my word for it. And lying is kind of a very small part of this. The bigger kind of worry for skeptics about other minds, this is the sort of skepticism about other minds, is that even if we're all speaking honestly to one another, how do we know that this is the classic case? It might be something like color inverted spectrum. So how do you know that what I see as blue is the same as what you see as blue, and so on? So there's this kind of skeptic that, you know, when I look at this pencil, there's a lot of philosophers in Wittgenstein's time, but still today, who would say they might use slightly different language today. So in Wittgenstein's time, you would talk of sense data. Today, people might talk of qualia, and there are sort of slight differences in the concepts. But the idea is that I have some kind of imagery associated with this in my head, and maybe you have some too. But how can we ever check whether what's in my head is the same as what's in your head? And now the beetle in the box parable, if you like, is meant to get us to think about this differently. And I guess from the outset, he has, you know, one thing that's important to remember is that Wittgenstein is an anti-skeptic. So he's arguing against the skeptic here. So he's not using the example to motivate skepticism about other minds. He's doing the opposite. But he's a very particular and peculiar kind of anti-skeptic, because he doesn't want to show that the skeptic is wrong, that the skeptic has a thesis that's false. He wants to show that what the skeptic is doing is either nonsense in the way Wittgenstein uses this word, which if we have time, we might talk about, so that what the skeptic is saying is really nothing. It's meaningless, it's vacuous, it's not false, according to Wittgenstein. now, how we understand nonsense is difficult here, whether it's like saying abracadabra or something, or abracadabra is a bad example, but blah, 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 or whatever, or whether it's sort of, one way of talking about it is like it's a wheel that moves nothing. It's got no pragmatic function. So the skeptic has a way of talking, and we can give meaning to those words within the philosophy classroom, but they don't really attach to real life kind of meaning. Now,
wait, I'm sorry. Can we
Yeah.
just clarify for the listener? And what would the skeptic's argument be?
So the skeptic's argument would be that while we're both, it seems we're all three of us are looking at the same pencil. We're all looking at it somehow indirectly, maybe you guys even less directly than me, because you've got the whole Zoom thing, or yeah, but we're because there's the pencil in reality, and then there's the kind of image of the pencil that we allegedly have in our mind. And there's a question of whether we see reality as it actually is, or whether we see it kind of indirectly through this image in our mind. And there are skeptics who try and back this up with science, and will say inversed images in the retina and so on. And there are discussions we can have about whether that's an accurate description of what's going on.
Illusionism, essentially the argument.
Yeah, it's a form of illusionism. So the thought is that, and not illusionism sort of about consciousness in a big way, but it's the thought that you might see things differently to how I see them. And I don't know, like philosophers, they distinguish between primary and secondary qualities. And the idea there, this is like an old distinction from early modern days, if not before, where the idea is that it's going to be very hard to think that you see a circle and I see a triangle. So sort of those kind of qualities, we can't be mistaken about that. But there might nonetheless be the sort of suspicion that, how do I know that what you see as blue is the same as me, or whatever? And more importantly, I mean, I've been using perception because it's really easy, but people talk of pain. How do you know that what you call pain is the same thing as what I call pain? So the skepticism starts from the thought that only I can have my pain. And Wittgenstein wants to tell us this is a grammatical remark. It's not an empirical remark. It's nonsense to say I can have your pain. Or if it's not nonsense, it might be true in this kind of looser metaphorical sense in which we say, I feel your pain, man, or whatever. But in the sense in which the skeptic wants to deny that I can feel your pain, Wittgenstein wants to say, this is not a possibility you're denying the truth of. It just makes no sense to say, I have your headache.
So question then, hopefully I understand the thought experiment. So essentially Wittgenstein begins with pain, right? I know how my pain feels. However, I may not know the experience of someone else's pain. So then he creates that thought experiment of the beetle in a box, and everyone has their own beetle in a box, or you can say their own pain, their own emotion, their own subjectivity in that box that no one else has access to except for that particular person. So, and that, okay, so that creates the understanding that, yes, everyone has a subjective sort of constantly changing interpretation of, not interpretation, rather something that's constantly in flux, that sort of subjectivity inside of them. Now, is he saying that because we have the commonality of language, so for example, when we talk about a concept like pain, for example, since we all understand what the concept of pain is, it doesn't mean that just because we can't understand someone else's pain that we can't talk about it. Is that the understanding, or?
That's certainly a big part of it. That's completely on the right track. So first of all, the beetle in the box, and I will talk more about that in a second. The beetle in the box is not there to defend skepticism, or it's there to try and to show what's misguided about skepticism. And you're right that one of the things that's going to be misguided about the skepticism that was prevalent even in his time, like in Russell's works and to some degree, and so on, is that we have this common language, and it wouldn't be even possible to say things like, you can't feel my pain, if we didn't have a shared understanding of what is meant by pain. And in fact, the remark, you can't feel my pain, for Wittgenstein is what he calls a rule of grammar. It's part of what tells us how we use the word and how the concept of pain functions. So it's part of the very concept of pain, that I can't feel your headache or something like, right? That's what we mean by a headache. It's not like we know what a headache is and then, oh darn, what a shame, I can't feel yours or something. That's part of what a headache is. And in the case of blue, what he would say is, when you say this is blue, this refers to what we're pointing at, and we're all pointing at the same thing. So blue is not the name of something inner. Blue is the name of something outer that we can all see and point to. So the common language and the shared concept refers to the fact that the criteria for getting something right, is this green or blue, is outer. It's what he calls outer criteria, not inward. It's not inside the mind. And likewise for pain, the criteria for whether someone is in pain, Wittgenstein wants to say, is that they're screaming in agony or saying ow or whatever. And when he talks about how we learn pain behavior, he says we just go ow, and then our parents, if they're sick of hearing ow, teach us, don't scream, say mommy, I'm in pain, or something like that. So now when we get back to the beetle with this in mind, the idea is that what's going to be the inner thing and what's going to be the outer thing here, as an analogy to what we just did with pointing here versus this kind of philosopher's obsession with pointing, introspection, right? The kind of pointing inner. And I think what's really powerful about the beetle in the box is that introspection is a kind of metaphor in philosophy, because it's not like you're drilling a hole in your skull and looking inside, right? It's a kind of metaphor, and he's trying to kind of push it to understand it. So the first thing he does is he takes it out. It's a box that I'm holding. So I'm no longer looking inner in some kind of sort of world that's in principle. I could open the box and show it to you, right? So he takes the inner and he puts it. It's still inner because it's inside the box, but now we've got something that's otherwise kind of external. So he kind of demythologizes this obsession with the inner theater of the mind, and now we have this inner theater of the matchbox. And it feels a lot more, it's a lot easier to understand what we mean by inner. It's just what's inside the box now. So we got rid of all this stuff that's kind of maybe complicated and obscure in some ways. But we keep what's important, which is no one can see inside other than me, right? If I close my eyes and imagine something, only I can see what I'm imagining. So we keep the first person authority, if you like, but we've got something that's very, and now, as Alan was saying, now begins the question of the language game. What is it that we're talking about when we talk about a beetle? And there's this thing that's very kind of famous or infamous in Wittgenstein called the private language argument. And whether it is an argument or a series of arguments or none of these things, and where exactly it occurs in Wittgenstein, and what the conclusion of the argument is, and what the premises of there's a lot of disagreement on this. So we can just kind of leave most of that aside for now, so we don't get completely distracted with exegesis. But part of what's going on in these series of remarks is that and this is what I think Alan was referring to earlier, is that language is a shared thing. It can't be the case that language is private all the way down. Only I know what I mean by any of the terms I use, whether it's pain, pencil, blue, or, coffee, lamp, Zoom. We wouldn't be able to, we're not communicating on some kind of faith that somehow by some miracle you're using the words the same way that I am.
Right.
So now when we talk about the beetle in the box, the question becomes, what is private and what is public in this kind of Wittgensteinian sense? What is in principle shareable and what is somehow unique to me? And of course, in principle is weird because I can open the matchbox and show you, but Wittgenstein wants to kind of push that and say that if we're already talking of, we've already agreed that beetle is the word we're using for what's in the box. So the skepticism that says, well, maybe you've got a caterpillar in your box and you're just calling it a beetle, or how do I know that you don't have a worm in your box? How do I know that's a beetle? How do I know you're using the word beetle in the same way as me? Well, it's a bit like this. Now, what are the outer criteria? That's hard to see because we've just got these matchboxes. So Wittgenstein says beetle just means whatever's in the box. That's what the word beetle means. Blue just, right? And so now whatever's in the box doesn't mean that beetle for me means what's in my box and for you means what's in your box. That would be like a private language. We all agree that beetle is what's in your box and my box and so on. So that's the shared language. And he pushes this. He says, maybe there's nothing in your box. And even if there's nothing in your box, we'd call that a beetle.
Right.
And so he's trying to see how this, what he calls a primitive language game works. How would the language game work of having these matchboxes that we're not allowed to look inside? And we're all talking of beetle. And it blocks, that way of talking seems to block the move, maybe you have a worm in your box, because beetle just is the word for the thing we all have in our boxes. Does that, I feel I've been babbling for so long.
I think I understand. We've essentially established a rule that we're calling this thing inside the box a beetle. So everyone now must essentially follow the rule that they have a beetle in their box. Even if they're lying, they're still referring to a beetle, which everyone sharing the commonality of language would understand what a beetle is, and therefore understand that there's a beetle in each person's box. And so you couldn't go beyond that and assume there's something else. I mean, even if they could lie, but barring lying, you're referring to it.
Yeah, lying is a sorry.
No, I know. I was just gonna add to that. So it seems like we're starting with the assumption that that we're essentially assuming that everybody has a beetle, right? So it's like where the skeptic would essentially say something along the lines of, well, we don't know if the beetle is there. If it isn't, right, we can't really we don't have like any proof because we're not in that person's head or their mind. Whereas Wittgenstein is saying, I think he's saying that it's actually not that important from my understanding of it. He's saying that no, we just have it.
It's not that important. And now if you leave lying, because skeptics, it's not lying that they're primarily worried about, right? It's the thought that even if we're all kind of being honest, we'll never know what the other is thinking or feeling or whatever.
Right.
And so now what can we do in the case of the beetle? Talking of illustrations, I might say, hey, Leon, can you draw us the beetle in your box, right? I'm not allowed to look in your box, but you can draw what that looks like.
Right.
And okay, if you're as bad as me, maybe we'll have trouble. But let's assume we're all as great as Helen is at illustrating things. So then we all illustrate the beetle. And now we have outward criteria for whether, assuming nobody is lying, we have outward criteria for whether, if you draw something and it looks like a snake, I might be like, oh, that's not what I meant by beetle. And that means that it's not that the things in all our boxes must be the same. Wittgenstein never says whatever's going on in your head and my head must be the same. The point is, if it isn't the same, there'll be a way of finding out, right? if your headache feels different, there'll be a way of finding out. And there's a nice example with color, which is, of course there are colorblind people, but hey, we know this. Why do we know this? Because they can't distinguish red from green, for example, and that criteria is public. We don't need to go into their head to see it. We can see that when the light changes from red to green, it makes no difference. And so that criteria is public, and it's the same with the beetle. If we all start drawing really different things, then we'll be like, oh, hey, okay, you've got something different there. You're beetle blind or whatever, if you can't tell the difference between my beetle and Alan's beetle or whatever. So it's this idea that the criteria are ultimately always public, because the language, what we mean by beetle, is going to be some, and we can even go as far, I might draw something and I might say, look, I did my best, but this doesn't quite look like the beetle in my box. Let me describe it to you better. And that's how it works. And of course, in doing all these things, we're using further words that are meant to be shared and so on. And part of Wittgenstein's point is that the skeptic isn't allowed to use any of these words. They're not allowed to even express their worry, because when you're using these words, you're sort of assuming they mean that the reader understands them the same way that you do. And so you've already kind of assumed an anti-skeptical position. Does that?
Yeah. And so what was the importance for him of this? Why was it important for him to share this with the world?
That is a very good question. Whether he thought he was sharing it with the world, he's got this preface to, Wittgenstein is a very precious sort of person, and he's got this preface that basically says, he doesn't know whether anyone else will understand his thoughts, but so long as one person could in principle. So it's not that he's here thinking, I'm going to convince the world of the, and sometimes he's speaking not explicitly but implicitly to very particular people, colleagues of his, friends of his, teachers, students, G. Moore, Russell, maybe people from the history of philosophy that he hasn't even read that much but knows about Descartes' views or whatever that's in the air. And he's really interested more generally to sort of move away from the beetle in particular in this idea that philosophy thinks that there are all these metaphysical problems, and that somehow if we think hard enough about them, we might reach a truth, whether it's skeptical or otherwise. And that really these are just linguistic problems, or rather they are philosophical problems, but we're, what he says, bewitched by language or by grammar. So there's something about the way words happen to work that misleads us into thinking there's something going on called metaphysics that we need to solve, when really if we just sat down and clarified, elucidated how concepts actually work, what he says is the problem would dissolve. So it doesn't get solved. It's not like there was a genuine problem and now here's the correct truth answer to it. Rather, the problem evaporates. And he sometimes talks of, it's like when you're in therapy and the cure is the problem is gone. It's not necessarily an answer to the problem. It's this way of seeing. And he liked Gestalt. He had a lot of objections to it, but what he liked about it was, the thought that you have a picture and people see different things in it, and you say, look at it this way, what do you see now? Look at it that way, what do you see now? And things can kind of, hence what we're calling thought experiments. He likes this idea of, think of it this way, imagine there's a beetle in a box or whatever, and he's trying to different pictures, he's trying to, and to show that really, if we get really clear about how our concepts work and elucidate them, particular problems will dissolve. New ones may come in because language is not a stagnant thing, right? It evolves with the times. And in fact, I think the beetle in the box is very relevant today, because there's a lot of talk in sort of AI stuff about black boxes and what's going on in the black box, and you get the kind of outward behavior, but you don't know what's in the black box. And that whole thing has come back in a new way for people doing AI intelligibility stuff. And if Wittgenstein is right, we might be thinking about that stuff in a really misguided way. So it can, and that these are applications, that particular application is not something Wittgenstein had in mind, but I think it extends to it. But what he wanted to do was to really, so young Wittgenstein wanted to dissolve the problems of philosophy once and for all. And he wrote his first book, the Tractatus, and he thought he'd done it, really arrogant thing to, and quit philosophy. That's it, I've done it. And he quits philosophy, and he famously goes off and teaches in the school and all sorts of things. And then he has this kind of, I guess, epiphany of sorts, but he kind of realizes that no, he hadn't done this, and that things were not as simple as he thought in his first book. And he comes back. So the Philosophical Investigations, which was published posthumously, where the beetle in the box parable is when he's come back to philosophy. And this time he's got no illusion that he can ever end it once and for all, because he's realized, I mean, it sounds very simple now, but he's kind of realized that language is alive and will constantly evolve, and these problems will keep reappearing in different guises. And as science evolves, there'll be new problems. And he was right about that, because they've all reappeared in neuroscientific form. All the problems of mind have reappeared as with mind replaced by brain, but really the stuff is kind of similar. But the language changes, and they look a little different, and so on. So he kind of understood that the task of the philosopher might never end, but that there was a kind of, the mission remains the same. And a lot of philosophers don't like this, because a lot of philosophers think he's saying there's no real subject here. He's saying it's all just, we're just sort of tricked by language, and we just untangle these things, and that's it. There's no big philosophical truth to discover. And so there's something there's a lot of nastiness about a lot that goes under the name philosophy in Wittgenstein, which he thinks of as bad philosophy. And then the job of good philosophy seems to just be to get rid of that. And some people think there's nothing positive here. So it frustrates a lot of philosophy. He's a very divisive figure for this reason.
Yeah, well,
you would think that, of course, if you add new variables with with growing technologies or advances in language,
especially neuroscience,
I mean, there would be always a new sort of emergent, right? And so a new sort of playing field in order to sort of attempt to translate, right? Or a new field to sort of try to get an understanding of the surroundings, right? So, I mean, it stands to reason that philosophy would always be evolving, right?
And
that's just simplistic, but sorry.
And then just talking about this, it made me think. So we had on the podcast a psychologist. Her name is Dr. Rachel Zoffness, and so she's an expert in pain management. And the way she understands it, it's really great and really nuanced. And I'm going to kind of butcher this because I'm not the expert that she is here, but I'm going to try my best. So the way she understands it is, so let's say, kind of to preface this first by saying, a lot of times, let's say when somebody's in pain, the way we kind of tend to think about it is like, oh, I was in the pain just like you were. Like, it's the same type of level, right? You're not in that much pain. And the other person might say, no, I'm really in pain, right? But you would say, no, I remember when I had that like level of pain. It wasn't that bad. You're kind of like, you're lying, or you're full of shit, or you might be seeking attention, or whatever it is, right? So Rachel would say, actually, no. So the reason is because and she sort of simplifies the neuroscience like for public consumption, and she would say there's something called an internal pain dial, and it's always affected by everything, right? So it's not only affected by your biology and physiology, it's affected by your environment, and it's also affected by your emotions or your emotional states. So she says, if you think about it, right, what happens is the pain sensors, right, they essentially, as the pain travels through them, or rather as it travels through the kind of neural pathways up to the brain, it travels between the limbic system, and the limbic system is your emotional center. So what happens is that limbic system affects the level how your brain pretty much interprets that pain. So like she gives these great cases. I don't want to go into it too much because it's not the point of our discussion, but she would give like a story about the guy who had a nail, like kind of, so there was he was a construction worker, and there was a nail, and you could think about this with like Phineas Gage too, but he had a nail, it pretty much it went through his boot, right? So I don't remember exactly what happened. He accidentally shot the nail gun, went right through the boot, and he's like, oh my god, I'm in such severe pain, we need to get me to the hospital, right? So they get this guy to the hospital. The entire time he's screaming, he's like, oh my god, this is like the most debilitating pain ever. They get to the hospital, they take his boot off, and they're like, this didn't even touch your toe. So it literally went right between, it went right between his toes, right? And so she asked the question of like, okay, how is that possible? How can a person who suffered no tissue damage whatsoever, right, how is that person experiencing pain, right, and in such a high degree? And so the idea there is that because the brain in a way kind of puts together this image of what it expects, right, and it expects, oh, it sees the boot, it sees the nail through the boot, and then it sees that, oh my god, like I'm really anxious right now, right, therefore I must be in pain. So anxiety, sort of sadness, anger even, right, it all kind of it works on and it amplifies, or even sometimes turns down your pain if you mitigate and manage it. Like let's say if you can tone down your sadness, if you could feel a little happier, if you could feel less fear, right, then all of a sudden, amazingly, you feel less pain. And it's the same thing with attention. The more attention you focus on pain, the more your brain thinks, oh, this is like something super important, so we need to kind of interpret this as pain because we need to get help for it. Chronic pain sufferers do this all the time. They consistently focus on the pain, and over years that somehow that pain amplifies and it becomes worse. So I wonder, thinking about this, I wonder what Wittgenstein would have thought about that. I wonder what it's like if we're saying, okay, the skeptic argument is essentially, well, I can't know your pain, but then we see, well, hey, no, actually neuroscience is showing us that we sort of can understand, at least to some degree, what another person's pain experience is. So even if, again, going back to the idea of like my headache doesn't seem to be as bad as your headache, we could say, well, yeah, based on kind of neuroscience research, because of all of these other factors involved, again, the person's emotional state, their environment, obviously seeing, a nail go through the boot, that actually affects your pain. So yeah, maybe for you, you might have said, you know what, I don't feel the nail actually even touching my toes. So, hey, I'm not in any pain. For that person, right, it's still the exact experience, right? Meaning that person isn't lying. They are actually still experience pain in that amplified way. So I guess I just wonder what Wittgenstein would have thought about that, having had the research that we have available today.
Sure. And first of all, I mean, that's fascinating research. And I'm always, just personally always interested in this. How do you decide whether someone has just like a lower or higher pain threshold, or whether they're feeling more or less pain? And is there a difference? The first thing Wittgenstein would want to ask is this just two ways of talking about the same thing? And he likes to always say, imagine a culture that speaks this way. And he would say something like, imagine a culture that describes this phenomenon you've just described. And he says, now imagine one group of people talk about it this way: you're in more pain than me. And the other group of people talk about it this way: we both feel the same amount of pain, but you can't tolerate it as well as me.
Yeah.
And then he says, is there a difference in phenomena, or is it just that there are two different language games? There's two different, and how do we decide? Now, of course, people do have maybe lower and higher pain thresholds. I'm not trying to deny this, but that's kind of his approach to this thing. It's to go into it kind of from the side and sort of say, well, let's be careful with the language here. The phenomena is fascinating, but now what is it that we're saying here, and what's the difference? Is there a difference? Is there a pragmatic? And Wittgenstein, he read a lot of William James, the pragmatist, but who also did a lot of experiments. So he was fascinated by studies about paralysis in relation to the will, and phantom limbs, and pains in, I have a pain in a leg, and then I realized I don't have the leg. How could I have a pain in that? So he'd have been fascinated by this research for certain. Now, exactly what he would have done with it is another matter, but I expect it would have taken the path of these kind of questions about what, could we imagine two ways of talking here, and what would the difference be between them? What do we mean when we say I have a lower threshold than you for the same pain? What does the word pain mean there? Does it mean for the same impact? Because that's very different. How could it be the same pain if I'm in greater pain when we have the same impact? So he liked to ask these sort of slightly annoying little questions that people are like, I just want to get on with the empirical research. And he likes to kind of pull the brakes and ask linguistic questions. But it's not because he thinks the research isn't valuable. It's about sort of getting clarity on how we describe it. And he really didn't like things like the brain tells me, or the brain recognizes, or whatever. So he would have maybe objected to those ways of talking about things, but that doesn't mean that he's anti-science or objects to these experiments. Quite the opposite. He was sort of very excited by this kind of stuff, because it gives us, apart from being interesting in itself, it gives us a kind of phenomenon where then we can then ask questions about why are we describing it this way rather than that way, and what's the difference. And that,
what does he think in general of subjectivity? Sort of the subjective experience.
Subjectivity is quite a big.
I just wonder, because like, if let's say the anti-skeptic position as well, subjectivity, if you start to kind of think about it, the idea there is that we can't really know, right? So the skeptical argument is that, well, we can't know another person's pain. I mean, but how would he see subjectivity, especially from I guess an empirical lens, if at all?
So I've got a view on this, so I can tell you what I think, but it is a little, not my view in particular, but the topic is a little contentious for Wittgenstein. But I think he over the years, if you look at his writing, his personal writing and his philosophy over the years, there's a real divide between what he says about subjectivity and related concepts as a philosophical problem, and what he says about it as an everyday real life problem. So when it comes to philosophy, it's all anti-skeptical in principle. There's nothing we can't know, understand each other, communicate, and so on, because there's no metaphysical problem, there's no unsolvable epistemic problem, and so on. But if you look at his real life and kind of I've used metaphysical and epistemic as kind of in principle worries about knowledge and subjectivity and so on. But if you contrast those to psychological, cultural, linguistic, and there, the subjective for him was something really hard to overcome. You look at his private letters to his friends, and they're all about how we will never be able to understand each other. Your mind works completely differently from mine. He ends friendships on this ground, like in really quite brutal terms.
Wow.
And it's all about there's nothing left in common between us. You were raised this way and I have this, and there is no way we could, and some of it feels a bit precious. Russell, he will never understand me. Moore will never. But then he goes on into, I could never understand this person, and I could never understand that. And it's really striking that he thinks at a kind of interpersonal level, whether the obstacle is cultural, psychological, one of kind of general temperament and disposition. I mean, the things he says, I mean, I don't want to say them because, out of context, they sound pretty, the things he says about people from other cultures and countries, I mean, it's really quite shocking stuff. And, part of it is of his time, but there's a real sort of, the subjective is huge, and some of it is interpersonal, as in this particular person and me, and some of it is the English, the Germans, the Chinese, like in groups of people who might fail to understand one another in this kind of very late 19th century, early 20th century sort of pessimistic anthropology of some kind.
Mhm.
So I think on the one hand, he thinks there's no philosophical problem with the subjective and the objective. There's no kind of real mystery there. But that
Right.
doesn't mean that we're all, walking around understanding one another perfectly. Quite the opposite. He's really quite sort of extremely skeptical about this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So the subjective there becomes something, he's almost paranoid, it's really
Mhm.
quite bad.
Yeah, wow. So, but I mean, it seems like the way he lived his life was actually as though he accepted the skeptical perspective.
So he accepts it, but not as this kind of philosophical problem. I think the difference is that in principle, the cultural and psychological stuff
Mhm.
can be overcome.
Right.
Mm.
You don't overcome it with a clever thought experiment.
Mhm.
You overcome it by spending a lot of time with the other person and doing the things they do and eating and drinking with them and sharing. And this fit with his philosophy in a way, sharing practices, and then the common language will flow out of that. So the answer isn't philosophical. The answer is you do this with shared behavior and shared activities in life. That's how you overcome the subjective. You don't overcome it with a clever argument. But you're right that in some ways, in his personal life, there is a kind of almost solipsism, almost skepticism,
Right. Yeah,
kind
and
of
I
there,
want
a kind of loneliness, maybe.
Yeah, so I'm glad you actually said that. So I mean, I know we don't have that much time, but
Sorry.
if it's okay with you, okay. So I want to actually kind of focus on the person that he was, because I know we talk a lot about ideas, and I love it, and it's great. But I think it's so much more important to talk about like the actual people and how they live their lives and how they embodied their philosophy. So I want to actually read a quote. So this is based on the New York Times article on Wittgenstein. However, I'm actually going to read a quote from one of my blogs because I couldn't get access to the New York Times article. So this is just about the person he was and how he viewed morality, which I think is really important. Okay, so let me just start. Okay, so for Ludwig Wittgenstein, character authenticity was the most significant facet of philosophy. In his conception of its purpose, Wittgenstein asserted that philosophy was, in essence, a working on oneself, and he used the act of confession, which I really love, and something I hope we get into. So he used the act of confession as a means of self-improvement. In the tradition of Leo Tolstoy and St. Augustine, the notable Christian ascetics, Ludwig conceived of confession not only as a way to punish himself, but also to gain insight into the consequences of his actions. He conflated confession with intrapersonal awareness, noting that dishonesty toward others was also dishonesty toward oneself. Although his life was full of unrelenting self-torment stemming from a perpetual quest for self-perfection, it exemplified the true meaning of authenticity, which is the courage to acknowledge one's flaws and to experience the acute guilt which accompanies them. So can you talk a little bit about that point of Wittgenstein? Because in a sense, right, he was not only just a perfectionist, but he felt like, well, I mean, maybe not a perfectionist in the sense of he believed he was perfect, but he believed that perfection was possible. And he spent a lot of time like literally beating the shit out of himself in order to become this better person and to become in some sense a saint. Is that kind of the sort of understanding you had of him?
Yeah, I know the person who wrote this New York, he's a friend of mine, the person who
Yeah.
wrote this New York Times article, and I remember discussing it with him when he was writing it.
Yeah.
So I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think that was a very good summary of the point. So he's a perfectionist. Certainly that stuff I was saying before about I can't understand anyone or no one can understand. That's because he sets the bar really
Right.
high
Yeah.
for what counts as understanding. If it's not perfect, right? And so he is a perfectionist in this way. I don't know if it's quite that he believes it's attainable. I mean, I think he thinks logically it's attainable. Whether he thinks it's actually possible in the time we have on Earth or whatever to attain it, that's another matter. But he's got this high bar, and he's got a very high bar, I guess, for morality. But that can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't mean that he was a very moral person. And, I don't know the guy, and I'm not here to tell you he was moral or immoral, but but it's that, he may have had completely the wrong standards, or he himself thought he was a moral failing in many respects. But the point is that it did torture him, that he really thought we had this kind of duty to be completely honest, completely authentic. And he really, really despised a lot of the sort of more theatrical, let's call them, aspects of life in a Cambridge college, for example, and the activities of high table and tea and all the kind of more poncy stuff. He really didn't like. Famously, he comes from a very rich family, but gives his money away to his siblings and some causes and so on. And then has to borrow money for train fare and things, and lives in this no pictures on Wittgenstein's wall, let me tell you, blank walls,
right,
very kind of austere, but there's this duty of not deceiving oneself, not
right,
deceiving others. And I guess, I think that is a personal thing, it's a personality thing that to some degree is separable from his philosophy. But I think he also thinks that he really despised any philosophy that was theatrics or sort of, he hated a kind of philosophy. It wasn't, popular philosophy is the wrong word for it. It was his philosophy that makes people think they've understood something when they haven't.
Mm-hmm.
He hated these lectures, whether in the same in science, these lectures where people come out thinking they've understood something, but they really haven't, and there's a kind of trick has been played, and he thought that was really inauthentic, and that it's better to come out thinking this is bloody hard and I didn't get it, or whatever.
Right.
Sorry,
Right.
I think I need a drink of water.
It's okay. It's okay. But so just to kind of add on to that, right? It's so impressive. I mean, as terrible as it was for his mental health, it's really impressive that here's this guy. And then for him, confession it seemed like the ultimate of life, that if you weren't able to confess, not just your sins, but just like who you are in total, it seemed like for him, then life was pointless, or the meaning of it was tied up in progress and, just kind of chiseling away at these flaws that people have, or that you have.
And yes, and he very famously tells I think it was Norman Malcolm, he tells but one of his friends that he's not religious, but he can't help seeing things from a religious point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And he had some Catholic friends like Elizabeth Anscombe, and I think while he himself lacked faith in God, had that Catholic disposition, he understood that need for confession and so on. So he's sort of someone who, very different from kind of new atheists today. He's someone who, while he lacks the faith,
right,
is in other ways completely sees things as if he was religious. And I think that confession aspect of it is a part of that. I mean, I don't know how much you remember from the New York Times article, but he did hit some children, and it was lethally, and so it's not just like getting beat up because you made a wrong turn or something. I mean,
right.
he it's a pretty bad thing to do. I don't know how else to put it mildly, and I think that was one of the things he was most sort of upset about, and trying to figure out what kind of person am I to have done such a thing. And he didn't brush it off lightly, but this is not, he was perfectionist about all sorts of things and maybe too harsh on himself on other things, but this was something that was really very serious, what happened.
Right. And
Yeah.
What's really great about this is just like it's even a concept in psychotherapy now where you would use confession in terms of like, let's say, perfecting yourself and, you know, becoming what you would consider, because in therapy we try our best obviously not to impose our morality on people, but what you consider to be a moral person. But there's this technique where you would use confession and you would essentially say, okay, if I screw up, right, I have to tell somebody about it, right? So you hold yourself accountable by actually pretty much forcing yourself to tell people about some of these flaws that you would normally keep to yourself. So it's so interesting that he kind of had this concept in mind. And look, I'm sure it's not unique to therapy. I'm sure anybody who's kind of involved in any level of introspection would want to do this. But I love that sense of accountability where the idea here is that by confessing, you're now making it known to the person that like, hey, here's this thing that I need to work on and I'm holding myself accountable for it.
That's it. And that somehow if you tell no one, you're lying to the whole world. Somehow you've kept this bad thing about you, and it needs to be, if you're going to be honest about it and overcome it, you need to share it with someone.
Yeah.
You're also essentially parsing out how you feel, in a sense. Some people may do that by writing, right? You'll put your thoughts into words, and then you are able to critically think about how you feel around a given subject, essentially.
Right.
Well, confessing may work in the same way. I mean, as opposed to the subjective experience of maybe you get these automatic thoughts, ruminating thoughts, or just let's say it comes at you so fast, the automaticity of how you feel about something. So you never quite really sit with it and think about it. But
Right.
when you either verbalize how you feel or write it down,
Right.
then essentially you get to really come to terms with how you feel about that particular thing.
Yeah,
I know it's general, but
yeah, and it's because it's a shared experience. Like we can't escape from having other people around us and from having them influence us, from us influencing them. And I think that this is, it seems from my perspective at least, that this is a core concept for Wittgenstein. Like the shared understanding seems to be at the core of, I don't know, maybe truth or finding truth.
I think that's right. And that's in a way that the tragedy of Wittgenstein is that this is very important for him, but he's not really sure he got it with many people in life. And he says, as I get older, the number of people I can understand who understand me keeps dropping, doesn't
Right.
get better. It gets worse as he gets older, he says. For whatever reason, people get set in their ways or whatever. But yeah, he kept a private diary, some of it coded, I think, and writing it down was as important as, or in a different way important from telling people, getting it, reflecting on it and writing it down and so on in this kind of very serious manner. But yeah, there's a kind of the thought that this is so important and he's not sure he really got it with many people. You know, I mean, he says, I've had a wonderful life on his deathbed, or words to that effect. I don't remember. So it's not, I'm not trying to paint it out like some sort of, like the guy died in misery or anything, but
Right.
There's something touching there nonetheless, I think.
Yeah. And what's interesting too about his death is that he actually ended up, I don't know if he ever finished the work, but he was still writing a book on his deathbed. Like he would literally get up while like, he was suffering. Well, he wasn't?
He was writing what's since been published as Uncertainty, which is a wonderful book. My colleague Danielle Moyle-Sharrock works a lot on it. The last entry is days before he died.
Right. Yeah. And it's so crazy that he was literally just like chugging along as he was pretty much near death and knowing that he was near death.
Wow.
So, all right, Constantine, thank you so much for coming on, man. This was such a great show. And
Awesome.
just, yeah, it seems like, I mean, most importantly, it seems like what you're trying to tell us is that Wittgenstein is still an incredibly relevant thinker.
It's my great pleasure. Sorry we didn't get to talk about Bob. I went on about Wittgenstein too long, but it's great to meet you both and to be on the show. And
yeah, and hey, man, you're welcome back anytime. So we could do a whole show on Bob Dylan at some point next year.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Absolutely. And then just before we go, let's plug your stuff. Where can we find you on social media?
Where can you find me? Certainly on Twitter, probably the best place to find me. I think it's just my initial and my surname, but I'm not sure.
I mean, we'll put up
And you have a
links.
if you
website as
can find
well.
me on Instagram, but if you don't like cats or vegan food, you're not going to really want to go there.
I hear you, but yeah, we'll put up.
I'm gonna post all the links essentially.
Yeah.
No worries. No
Yeah.
worries about plugging.
Yeah, so thank you so much again for coming on. We'll talk to you soon.
Real pleasure.
Thank you.
Absolutely,
Take care.
man. Bye.
See you. Bye bye.
Cool. Well,
All right.
guys, first of all, that was awesome.
Yeah.
I haven't read too much Wittgenstein.
He's really complicated.
I pronounced
man.
the name wrong
Yeah.
probably 5 different times.
Yeah,
But,
there are even like literally graduate students that don't understand them.
oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll tell you this: I have a better understanding of him today than I did yesterday.
You're right.
100%.
Mhm.
Anyway, guys, if you want to follow us, you could follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, as well as TikTok.
Yes,
And at
same thing.
Seize,
Seize the moment podcast.
that's right.
Mhm.
And at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell.
hit the bell. And guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a happy new year and see you next year.